New Explorer Corps, First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, System J4884B2, February 6th, 3152, dawn. Captain Rin Barrett stood silently several hundred yards away from the ship wreckage and buildings that made up the settlement that had been so very unwelcome the day before. Behind her, just yards away, stood Olivia's Thunderbolt in silent, motionless vigil. They had marched down from the small plateau that overlooked the settlement just an hour before, just as the star was rising behind them on the dawn dusty light. The mech cast a long shadow that almost reached the dirt street of the settlement. Rin waited, knowing that if they stomped their mechs into the settlement, they could very well lose another one. Instead, the wind blew dust over her boots, and the seconds and minutes passed. More than once, she felt the urge to order the mechs to fire on the settlement and wipe out those who cut down Tenika's Zeus. It would likely be an easy route, if not for the almost certain death of the young Mechwarrior. Without a response after several more minutes, she opened her comm link with Olivia and told her it was time to wake them up. Even with earplugs, the sound of the particle projection cannon firing so close to where she was standing gave Rin a throbbing headache. It crackled over much of the wreckage that made up the settlement, though it did hit several of the larger struts that protruded up into the sky. As quickly as it lashed out, the energy dissipated, leaving only the crackling of a few fires caused by dripping metallic slag. Almost a full minute passed, and Rin was about to ask for a second shot when Olivia called down from her high perch. "Captain, we've got someone on their way out," she said through the comms. Rin felt relief, as perhaps there was still a way to find an end to this nonsense without bloodshed. From the blowing dust, she could gradually make out the man slowly walking out past the bits of ship and metal structures. As he approached, she could make out his worn clothing of grays and faded reds. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that looked like something from out of one of those ancient kids' cartoons about wrangling cowfolk. In his hand, he carried a rifle of a make and model that Rin couldn't recognize. At about 10 meters, the man stopped and looked up, showing Rin his face for the first time. Weathered and sun-baked, he could have been about 40 or 80, depending upon how harsh life had treated him. Rin slowly moved her hand from the laser pistol in its holster, as it looked like he wasn't in a hurry to shoot her. The two just looked at each other for a few moments before the man asked in a gravelly voice, "You want something?" Considering her answer for a moment, Rin responded, "I'd like my Mechwarrior and what is left of her mech back." This time, it was someone else's turn to take a deep sigh. You get her back and your mechs obliterate the settlement a moment later," the man said. "I am Captain Rin Barrett of the New Explorer Corps. I have no interest in harming you. We only sought to make contact with what we thought was a settlement," Rin said in as authoritative a tone as possible. "Well, from the 14 dead friends I have under a tarp back there, I'd say you have at least a little interest in it," the man said. Rin furrowed her brow, briefly considering drawing her pistol to shoot him. Instead, she said, "You did lure us into an ambush and fire on us first. Shooting second in a fight with Battletech is a surefire way to get wiped out by pirates," the man retorted as he adjusted his casual grip on his rifle. "We aren't pirates," Rin said. "So you claim. Doesn't matter. The damage is done. Get on your ship and piss off," he added. Rin looked out toward the dropship and pondered the plan for a moment. On the far side of the settlement, Vasil was waiting in hiding for a signal to head into the settlement. After nearly a minute, she said, "I'm sorry about your friends, but we cannot leave without Tenika," using her name to foster that personal connection. "Can we propose a trade? What does your settlement need that we might have on our ship?" "Your mechs are nice. You can leave us one," the man replied as he gazed up at the white thunderbolt. "Try again," Rin said. "We've got some food and medical gear. How much of that do you have out here?" "We get by," the man replied. On the other side of the settlement, Vasil lay in his battlesuit behind the closest rock outcropping he could get to without risking discovery. May was a few hundred yards further back in her commando. He had been there, motionless, for 4 hours, and was waiting for the signal if things went poorly for Rin's negotiations. He watched the conversation play out over a small cam link in his heads-up display thanks to the feed provided by Olivia's Thunderbolt. Every moment of the wait annoyed him. These people had taken his friend and destroyed her mech. Through the few years he was a clan Jade Falcon warrior, he understood how those two things could devastate someone. He needed to get her out of this place. Vasil flipped through the various vision modes in his heads-up display looking for where people might be hiding. A few locations jumped out as good spots to set up weapons, and after looking at the video from the ambush, he had nearly 24 other spots where shots originated. This time, he would be the hunter. All he needed was the signal, or a move from the man with the rifle. If he lifted that rifle, he would be racing into the fray, and May would be rolling in with her commando as soon as she could clear the terrain from where she was hiding. "I wish this could have gone differently," Rin said before adding, "We only wanted to help." The man laughed condescendingly before replying, "And look at the result of your arrogance." That one stung. Rin looked away again, trying to come up with a solution here that wouldn't involve more bloodshed. "We can..." In the distance, a shot rang out, which drew the attention of both Rin and the man. He lifted his rifle in an instinctual response, and a half-second later an explosion ripped through one of the buildings on the far side of the settlement. "You pirate trash!" he screamed as he brought his rifle to his shoulder. Too late, as Rin's pistol fired and 3 blackened holes were burned into the target's chest. Unable to take another breath, the man slowly stepped back, the rifle dropping from his hands to the dusty ground. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and hatred. She stared into his eyes and watched his face as he slumped to the ground. A tear rolled down Rin's cheek as she felt the crushing impact of failure. As she slumped to her knees in the dirt, Olivia stepped the Thunderbolt in front of the captain and began to select targets among the buildings and wreckage for return fire. Small plumes of dust kicked up around Rin as she looked down at the gun in her hand. The carnage taking place in front of her dulled to gentle thuds. The rattling cacophony of autocannon and machine gun fire rang out, but sounded very far away in her ears. She couldn't muster the will to stand, or even move for cover, as every corner, window, and debris pile seemed to be spewing fire in all directions. At her, at the 2 mechs now advancing, and at Vasil, who was up and running the second he saw the man's rifle go up to his shoulder. Both Olivia and May were keeping to targets near the edges of the settlement, betting that it was unlikely that Tenica would be kept on the outskirts. The Thunderbolt and Commando began to circle the perimeter, firing when a target was clearly exposed and firing at them. The plan was to cause distraction without causing too much damage. Vasil's job was to infiltrate and find Tenica as quickly as possible, hopefully before it was too late. In and out of structures, Vasil fired the occasional small laser burst as rounds ricocheted off of his armor. Every moment that passed was increasing the likelihood that Tenica would be harmed. Bursting into one room, which involved most of the entire pressed steel wall collapsing around it, an astonished group of young people looked up at the elemental in sheer terror. Vasil looked them over quickly, seeing that their gear was cobbled together nonsense, and ran past them out the other side of the building. Steel lean-tos, improvised bunkers, hallways, and the occasional brief exchange of gunfire filled the next few minutes of his life. Rin stood slowly and holstered her pistol. Lifting her gaze, she saw the worst-case scenario of their plan playing out, and it made her sick to her stomach. Damn these people for making her do this. All she wanted to do was help, and now people were dying. They stole a moment from her, a moment she felt she deserved after doing so much work. Stepping forward, ignoring the occasional shots that still came her direction, Rin walked up to the body of the man who now glared motionless at the sky. At that moment, something broke in her. She couldn't vocalize what it was, but she felt the impact and the consequential loss. Olivia efficiently employed her ER medium lasers to carve out positions, silencing the larger guns that lashed out at her and May's mechs. Gradually, the minor damage being inflicted to her mech's armor dwindled to just small arms fire and the occasional near miss from mortar rounds. Deeper within the structure of the crashed warship, Vasil was working up to a fevered anger. Every room he checked, as he forced his way deeper into the settlement, was one room closer to Tenica, and every second that passed was also 1 second closer to losing her. As he descended into the lower levels, the number of soldiers firing at him dwindled, and the number of families and children increased. Often they huddled in abject terror as the gigantic battle-armored figure peeked into rooms and moved on. His armor scraped the sides and the ceilings of the hallways and rooms as they were never meant to fit an elemental. This noise intensified the fear of the settlement's inhabitants as Vasil continued his search. Outside, the firing weapons eventually petered out as small groups of people surrendered and walked out away from the buildings with their hands up. May and Olivia stopped circling the structures, meeting up to watch over the increasing crowd of prisoners. It was clear that the settlement's defenders would not be able to replicate the destruction of Tenika's Zeus twice over without the element of surprise. Most sat looking shell-shocked. Others tended to their wounded peers. Captain Rin wiped away an angry tear as she walked away from the settlement toward the ridge where the Eulalia waited. She wanted nothing more to do with this planet. She wasn't even sure she wanted to continue the mission. All she could feel was a growing anger. A near silence fell over the settlement as the last of the defenders walked out and sat down at the feet of the mechs. Nearly 60 by Olivia's count as she scanned her eyes over them looking for any hidden threats. "Vasil, what's a good word? We're all wrapped up and quiet out here," Olivia spoke into the comms, trying to conceal her concern for the outcome of the search. The comms were silent, and it felt like a long time before May chimed in. "There's probably some interference with all the steel in the way." Her concerned tone was much more obvious. The wind shifted again, bringing more dust to settle on the prisoners who sat in silence, many of which looked like they were extras from one of those old docudrama holovids on the Succession Wars. She put out a second call for Vasil, but only got silence in return. Down in the bowels of the ancient crashed ship, Tenika could feel the rumble of explosions through the steel wall she was sitting against, and it made her smile a bit, knowing that her friends wouldn't abandon her. The two scruffy guys in charge of making sure she didn't miraculously break her zip-tied bindings were starting to look uncomfortable. With the gentle thudding and the occasional drift of dust down from the furniture, their glances at each other were more and more concerned. "You guys are probably going to want to undo these bindings before my friends get here," Tenika said. One of the guards replied with, "Why is that?" "Because one of those friends is a 300-pound clan elemental with anger issues," Tenika said with a smile. The two guards looked at each other again with growing concern. A few seconds later, the sound of grating metal against metal and the heavy footfalls of battle-armored feet on metal plating grew closer. "Sounds like 1 or 2 levels up. Won't be long now," Tenika said, widening her smile. By the time Vasil smashed his way down to the 5th sub-level of this place, his armor showed the litany of scratches, bullet divots, and the odd burn from a laser pistol. He was furious at this point, and even though his vision narrowed, he continued to turn and look into each compartment as he pushed his way deeper. Reaching the end of the hallway, up against the bulkhead, he turned and looked into the last cabin. He had hoped to find Tenika, of course, but he hadn't expected to see her leaning back in a chair with her feet up on the table. "What took you so long?" she asked with a smirk. Rin was walking up the loading ramp of the Eulalia when her comm activated. Olivia's voice was clearly excited as she said, "Tenika's safe! We got her!" Rin felt a rush of relief, which dulled the intense ache of disappointment. The captain turned to look back down at the settlement for one last time before walking away from the scene and replied, "Let's get out of here." A few minutes later, she shed her dusty uniform and stepped into a small shower in the captain's quarters. Resting her head against the wall as the hot water cascaded over her, Rin cried harder than she had since childhood. Tenika's excitement over her rescue had faded to misery as she had learned that the Zeus was not salvageable. She had insisted that Vasil bring her to the junked mech, which had been in the process of being dismantled by the settlement's junkers when the attack happened. The dispossessed Mechwarrior wanted to lash out at those who had done it, but when they walked out of the settlement and saw the sorry, defeated state of the men and women under the watchful eye of Olivia's Thunderbolt, the anger faded to pity. New Explorer Corps. First Arm, Spinward Operations Area, System J4884B2, the Rabbit's Foot, Jimishu Class Jumpship, February 10th, 3152. Cal Levitt had trouble understanding what exactly had taken place on the planet. The report transmitted from the Eulalia was written by May and not Rin, which was concerning. It was light on details, but did include the following. The settlement had nothing of value for the mission. We left food and supplies and are returning. When the Eulalia was fully docked, Levitt was there waiting to talk with Rin, who blew past him as if he wasn't there. He looked at her in shock as the other crew began to head through the open airlock. Each looked more sullen than the last. Levitt asked repeatedly what happened, but the most he got in return were dour looks and a headshake from Vasil. Ariana poked her head into the passageway and then locked it on May. She took the Mechwarrior's arm and the two headed off on their own. Kip leaned against the doorway further down the hallway, not saying anything but taking in Rin's distressed behavior before glaring at Vasil. When Levitt saw Tenika's face, he knew something terrible had happened. Not taking silence for an answer, he stepped in front of her and asked, "What the heck happened?" Tenica sighed, shrugged her shoulders, and responded, "A misunderstanding led to gunfire. My Zeus is gone." "Your Zeus? How?" Levitt asked, completely dumbfounded. Vasil's hand fell to Levitt's shoulder from behind, and the elemental said, "Later." Still looking for answers, Levitt talked to the science team and the crew of the Eulalia. While he was able to piece together much more of the story at that point, he still wanted to know details. Specifically, what had the captain so worked up with that she had locked herself in her cabin and ignored comm requests. He had never seen her like this before, and every warning signal in Levitt's brain told him this wasn't a run-of-the-mill disappointing mission. As the rabbit's foot was made ready for its next jump, Rin stayed in her cabin. She was reclined in her bed, her eyes were shut tightly as she tried to focus on the recording playing in her headphones. She tried to stop replaying the events over and over in her mind, but the memories fought her. Who fired that damn shot? Why didn't that guy just take the food and gear? Damn it! 12 hours later, in the cargo bay of the Eulalia, Tenica sat on a crate and looked at the gantry that used to hold her mech. When she closed her eyes, she could take in all the sounds and smells of the bay, and it almost felt like when she opened them, her Zeus would be standing there. Though, when she did open her eyes, it was gone. This process hadn't worked for the last 37 attempts, and she was midway through the 38th when she heard the distinctive sound of bootsteps with a very long gait make their way closer. "I'm not sure I'm in the mood for a pep talk," Tenica said without looking. "I do not do pep talks. I am here because you need to refocus," Vasil said. Tenica finally looked up at him before saying, "Refocus on what? The fact that I'm a dispossessed Mechwarrior on a mission that doesn't have any use for me? Or maybe the fact that I lost the mech that had been in my family for generations?" Vasil listened to her questions, but it didn't show any sign of reaction. He rarely did. He just quietly listened, and when he was ready, he responded, "A warrior does not cease to be a warrior when you take away her weapon." Tenica frowned, looked back toward the empty gantry, and shook her head. "Sounds like something you would hear in a self-help holovid. When I lost my clan and the people I swore I would protect, I felt lost. I traveled to the far side of the galaxy to avoid having to face my failures and to avoid any new opportunities for failure. I now know that no matter where you go, there are people who need help and there are people who do help. You, Tenica, are a person who helps. This is why we are friends," Vasil said in the longest string of sentences she had ever heard from him in a single statement. Immediately after, Tenica surprised Vasil in return by standing quickly and hugging him. He didn't react immediately, but after a few moments slowly wrapped his arms around her back and returned the hug. End Part 8. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the latest installment of the series. If you have any thoughts, input, or have noticings, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. As this story continues to unravel, the feedback has been very encouraging. I'm actively working on sorting out the YouTube channel memberships with Google, so those may be coming soon. Until then, if you want to support the channel and other creative ventures, best way to do that, besides making sure you're also subscribed to the channel and hitting that like button, and share the videos with those who also might enjoy them. If you want to go one step further, I do have a Ko-Fi link in the comments below. Just a quick heads up, there will not be a new Explorer Core video on February 20th, as I'm going to be on a little trip that will keep me away from computers for a bit. Until I see you again, take care and go make the world a slightly better place today and tomorrow.